Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Lewicki. In Armenia, a major dispute is brewing where politics and religion intersect, as the head of the Armenian Apostolic Church, Catholicos Karekin II, faces trial of alleged misconduct of a clergy appointment. Yet beneath the veneer of procedural bickering lays a deeper political standoff between the church leader and the country's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, with accusations of Russian ties and bitter feelings over Nagorno-Karabakh adding heat to an already intense confrontation. Joining us here today to discuss this story is Richard Giragosian, founding director of the Regional Studies Center. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you.
Right, so let's begin with an explanation of what this dispute is really about. Why is the leader of the Armenian Apostolic Church standing trial?
Well, what we see in the broader context is this is not just a political confrontation, but a personal conflict between the Armenian Prime Minister and the head of the Armenian Church. This is driven by the government's recognition of a threat from the church leadership, seeing the church leader as the last remaining institutional link to the former government. And unfortunately, we do see a war of words. We see a race to the bottom in terms of the discourse. And what this has become now is unfortunately an unprecedented test of state versus church relations. And the judiciary seems to have been weaponized by the Armenian government in this conflict.
So it appears that this conflict really does have many different aspects. So let's go through them one by one. First, you mentioned that the church is perceived as a link to the previous government. Is that really the perception? Not as autocephaly of the church, the autonomy of the clergy, but actually a political position that is being held over from the previous administration, in a way, through members of the clergy itself?
Well, that's a good question. And to clarify, it is the leader of the church himself that represents the close personal link, past endorsement, and political affiliation to the former government of Armenia and the formerly authoritarian leaders of Armenia. So in this context, it's more about a conflict between the prime minister and the head of the church, and less about the church versus the state or the government. Nevertheless, what we do see is an unfortunate escalation. Armenia had a democratic election just 2 months ago. This is an unnecessary distraction from much more important problems and challenges facing Armenia.
So on a procedural level, this is really about one member of the clergy who was defrocked, and later on a civil court essentially told the church, no, you're wrong, you need to reinstate that man. Has the judiciary overstepped its mandate here? To what extent is the church protected by constitutional safeguards of autonomy?
Well, this is the real test and the real question, because what we see is a Vatican-style power struggle where the government and the prime minister was emboldening and backing 10 rival bishops in an attempt to force out the leader of the church. That effort has failed and faltered, but the court ruling is an attempt to reinstate some of these renegade bishops. But what's unfortunate is this is less a question of law and more a test of political will. And it is unprecedented in terms of judicial interference in internal church political decisions and leadership. Similarly, in this way, it's more of a classical Vatican power struggle, much less about faith and much less about the rule of law.
So now you've mentioned there is a personal animosity between Nikol Pashinyan and Catholicos Karekin II. But what about their political positions? Because they differ as well. Can you explain the different visions of where Armenia should be headed as displayed by the Prime Minister and the leader of the Church?
very good point, because when we talk about the leadership of the church and its links to the previous government, there are also two underlying drivers or factors. First is the church leadership unfortunately entered politics for the first time in opposition to the current government. That unprecedented foray into politics failed miserably, but it did shake confidence in the church leadership, which in terms of Armenian modern history, the church is popular because of its decision to refrain from politics. The second underlying factor here is the Armenian government's policy of normalization with neighbors, including post-war compromise with neighboring Azerbaijan, the defeat of the war of 2020, the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan's military, both represent diametrically opposed positions between the Armenian government versus the Armenian church. So yes, there's an underlying political and policy context to this confrontation.
And I mean, this is something that is likely to resonate with many people in Armenia, because on the one hand, obviously, you've got those who want a compromise, they want greater trade relations, a greater stability, but there are also those who might have roots in Nagorno-Karabakh, those who still remember the times when Kantendi was called Stepanakert, right? So they have this protect the land kind of attitude. And these people, or those who sympathize with them, they still have a powerful voice. Do you think that this could be the point on which the Catholicos could have a substantial public support versus the Prime Minister as the one who protects the legacy of Armenian presence in Nagorno-Karabakh?
Well, to be honest, yes and no. In specific terms, what we see is a recent democratic election in Armenia that saw the incumbent government of Armenia re-elected with a fresh mandate to continue diplomatic engagement with its neighbors and normalization, and much less about a nationalist agenda. But at the same time, the attack on the church leadership is destabilizing. It's resonating not just across Armenian society, but the global diaspora as well. It's a very unpopular and generally unnecessary provocation. And I do think that there's a need for an immediate escalation and a search for a face-savoring compromise. But unfortunately, both sides, the church and the government, seem increasingly reluctant to back down first.
As evidenced perhaps by Nikol Pashinyan accusing the Catholicos of being pro-Russian, and even the Church of actually furthering Moscow's agenda. Does he have any evidence to back that claim?
I would say no. It's largely circumstantial, in particular in that the Armenian Apostolic Church is not Orthodox. It has no real vulnerability to Russian influence as, say, the Orthodox Church in neighboring Georgia. However, the leader of the Armenian Church, his brother is a bishop in Moscow. He is known to have political, personal, and perhaps financial ties to Moscow. But put this in a zero-sum game, Russia versus Armenia, is both disingenuous and also dangerous.
Why would that be dangerous? Is it just because of the possible instability and just stoking tensions, or is there anything more to this particular aspect of the conflict?
I would argue dangerous in terms of a pre-existing crisis in relations between Armenia and Russia. Specifically, what we see is Russia is now perceived in Armenia as dangerously unreliable, very unpopular, and a degree of understanding that Russia betrayed Armenia in the past several years. But to add a further accusation against Moscow in this conflict with the church is unnecessary and also inaccurate.
So now it seems that we have something of a stalemate. I mean, even the court proceedings have really not gone anywhere, because the judge in the case, shortly after it started, said that he has to step down because there is a conflict of interest concerning his own personal history as a legal professional, with the counsel acting for the defendant. So where do you see this going, both in terms of the actual trial, but also in terms of the political clash that we're seeing? That, as you said, it's unnecessary and a de-escalation would be in order. But can we expect something like that to happen?
Well, starting with the positive news, the decision by the judge to recuse himself over potential conflict of interest charges is a reassuring and refreshing demonstration of confidence in the judicial process, meaning that the judiciary perhaps will adopt a more objective approach to this case than, say, the government's personal vendetta. At the same time, the need for mediation, compromise, is apparent, and there is an opportunity for a face-saving compromise to be negotiated. But it does require one side or the other, the church or the government, to step back and to step down from this war of words. Without such a de-escalation, the likelihood of a compromise is further away, unfortunately.
Do you think Catholicos Karekin would be willing to do that? He had in the past been essentially demanding that the Prime Minister step down from his position. Are these two individuals too far gone in their personal conflict to reach out to one another and try to build bridges over this widening rift?
Well, to be honest, I criticize both. In other words, the leader of the church overstepped the line by engaging in opposition politics and entering the political arena. This undermined confidence and faith in the Armenian church and was a mistaken move. Nevertheless, I do criticize the government as well for engaging in this personal vendetta, where much more important issues remain unresolved. But I do see a degree of optimism in that both have now so far overstepped the line that both the Prime Minister and the leader of the church will understand they risk unpopularity by continuing to wage this battle.
So one final aspect that's tangentially related to the conflict. Do you think there is a risk that the ongoing dispute is going to weaken the position of the Armenian Church in the ongoing task of monitoring the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh? There have been accusations of religious sites, Armenian religious sites, being razed to the ground by Azerbaijan. So wouldn't it be in the interest of the government to have the Church engage in this sort of monitoring mission, raising awareness? Or perhaps is the government willing to sacrifice this legacy for the sake of achieving diplomatic stability with its neighbor?
I would say no, specifically because Azerbaijan's campaign of the destruction of Armenian monasteries, churches, the erasure of the cultural legacy of Nagorno-Karabakh is both a global issue now and a widespread, deep, painful issue within Armenian society. The role of the church in monitoring this is minimal, if not marginal. At the same time, I would say we do see the church already weakened by the leadership's decision to enter politics for the past several years in opposition to the government. Support for the Armenian church remains strong. However, personal support for the leader of the church is weakening.
Richard Giragosian was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Jonasz Lewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.